Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Digital Imaging Group, I'd like to wish you all a very happy new year. Welcome to our first event of the new year, Abstract Photography as Fine Art with Nat Coalson. I'm Avril Christiansen from the Southeast Digital Imaging Group, and today's meeting has been jointly organised by us together with the Creative Eye Group. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all 522 of you here with us today. We're glad to see so many of you taking the time to be with us. In addition to members of the Creative Eye and the Digital Imaging Group, we have many Royal Photographic Society members and non-members from all over the world, some even from Australia, the United States and Mauritius. Before we start, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you'll know how to participate in today's event. This Zoom event has a special question and answer feature. At the bottom of your screen, or maybe at the top if you're using a tablet, you will see a question and answer icon, Q&A. You can click on this to ask a question at any time during the presentation. At the end of Nat's presentation, there will be time for him to answer your questions. Nat's presentation is going to be so good that you will immediately want to thank him for it, but please don't do this. You will have an opportunity to feedback to Nat after the event, and we pass all of your comments on to him. So please ask questions only, and Nat will answer as many as time permits. Without further ado, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Nat Coalson. Nat is an American photographic artist, gallery director and author, living in England and working worldwide. He gained his associateship of the Royal Photographic Society, and he loves talking about, writing about and teaching photography to groups as well as to people on a one-to-one basis. As I hand over to Nat, I just want to remind you that you can use the question and answer feature throughout Nat's presentation, asking questions as you think of them. I'll then ask your questions of Nat at the end of his presentation. I'd now like to hand over to Nat Coalson. Nat, if you'd like to start screen sharing.
Thank you, Avril, and thank you very much to the RPS Digital Imaging Group and Creative Eye. I'm honored to be presenting today, especially on a topic which is so near and dear to my heart. As Avril mentioned, I do write and teach and present a lot of various photography-related topics, but abstract photography over the years has become my true passion and really my main focus of my photographic practice. So my aim today is to share with you some of my work and talk to you a little bit about how my body of work has evolved over the years, and also give you some tips and techniques for how you can develop your own abstract photography, should that be something that you'd like to pursue. So real quick, and I won't spend too much time on this, I'll have a chance to sort of touch on some of this again at various points throughout the presentation as well as in the Q&A, but I thought it would be helpful for those of you who don't know me to know a little bit about my background. I come from a graphic design background. I've always worked in the visual arts. And I started working in print and then multimedia and web. And I sort of found my way to photography through maybe a long and circuitous route as a designer. And so eventually I did start a business in around 2003 doing fine art photography. And at that time I was living in Colorado. I grew up in Denver, right near the Rocky Mountains. And when I first started in photography, my real interest was in nature and landscape and the great outdoors. And so this sort of discovery of abstraction has been an interesting journey for me. Along the years of my career, I've worked first as a gallery manager and a framing technician as I was building my fine art business. And so I was very fortunate to be able to sort of develop my photographic body of work in conjunction with learning production techniques, as well as framing and finishing and display and exhibition. And so this presentation today, we're not only going to talk about photography, but we're also going to talk about how to produce it into a finished product that can hang on the wall, and then how to go about doing exhibitions. And for those of you who might be interested in selling your work, I do have some tips for that as well. So I've been an exhibiting artist for many, many years. I've participated in group exhibitions and done solo shows at various venues. I've acted as a judge and juror and a curator of many shows. And so I really believe that the exhibition aspect is really crucial to developing your body of work as well. Now, as Gavril mentioned, I do also own a gallery here in the UK. We're based in the Midlands. I own a gallery called Photique in Leamington Spa. And over the past few years, we have been very pleased and privileged to exhibit the work of a lot of photographers, not only from the UK, but from around the world. So as a gallery owner, my views have maybe shifted and evolved and changed a little bit, especially with regard to evaluating work, and sort of putting together a collection or a body of work, if you will. I'm going to talk a little bit more in a bit about working in series and why it's so important to work on personal projects. But maybe first, let's talk a little bit about sort of how I came to find abstraction. Now, in going through my body of work or my Lightroom archives, I was looking for images that would help sort of identify a trend in my work. And this is something that I really recommend all photographers and really all kinds of artists do from time to time. You want to look at your historical work and see if you can find trends and patterns and sort of pivot points. And there were a few images as I was doing a lot of nature, landscape, kind of outdoor photography that I realize now that started taking me towards abstraction. So this first image is one of those where, as you can see, it's just a very simple composition of a small rock in a pond, some reflections, a very blank white field of snow behind. And this, to me, sort of symbolizes my early days in my journey as a serious photographer. And it's from here that I started building eventually towards doing the abstractions that you'll see in a bit. So this picture goes back probably, I don't know, 2005, 2006, maybe. This is another one that, I produced quite a few years ago now that, in many respects is leading towards abstraction, but this is not what I would call, a true abstract photograph. It is very graphic. It's almost minimal in its composition. It's very two-dimensional. And this is one of the things about my work that it actually took me quite a long time to identify. And looking at my collections and the work that I felt strongest about, I'm starting to notice that my favorite pictures are very flat and very two-dimensional. I don't use a lot of depth perspective. I don't use a lot of leading lines. I don't use a lot of sort of foreground anchors. All of these techniques that many landscape photographers use to sort of bring you in and give you depth in a picture, I actually prefer things to be very sort of flat. And I kind of attribute this to my years working in graphic design, which obviously is a very sort of two-dimensional medium. So along the way, shooting in nature, again, I'm making pictures like this, which again, I wouldn't call this truly abstract because you can clearly make out what it is, a very smooth rock shape surrounded by water. But again, this is leading towards abstraction, and I'm starting to see some elements that I can build on. And this is one of the key techniques that I would encourage all photographers to do, is as you're looking at your best work, and even when you're looking at pictures that maybe didn't work as well as you would have hoped, you want to be identifying what are the key elements and the motifs, or the things that you kind of keep using again and again and you keep coming back to. So this picture was taken just after this previous one. Okay, this is in the same spot, and you can actually kind of make out down at the bottom the water line where the water meets the rock eventually led me to this. So this kind of illustrates a process of working where I'm getting tighter and tighter and tighter, not necessarily going to macro. And I probably shot this with quite a long lens, from a distance away and just zoomed in very tight. But what I'm doing is using the frame as a means of exclusion. And I'm really isolating something very, very specific. Now, this, I would say, is getting much closer to true abstraction. But, that's very subjective. Many among us might be able to very quickly identify this is a wet rock with some water. Okay, so whether or not something is truly abstract, it really has kind of a lot to do with the viewer. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. This has been one of my most successful photographs over the years. I've printed and reproduced this on many occasions in different sizes, on different materials. I wouldn't, again, call this true abstraction, because if you're savvy enough to make out what's going on here, it really is nothing more complex than some very shallow water running over colored pebbles. And this, again, though, I use as an example because it was a real turning point in my photography. A group of friends and I had been out in the morning. This is up near Crested Butte in the central mountains of Colorado. And we'd spent the morning shooting these huge, wide landscapes and the grand scenics, and it was autumn. So there was a lot of fall colors around. And, the whole purpose of us being out there at that time and on that day was to shoot, the landscapes and the big nature. It wasn't very long before I discovered this little stream. And I actually spent the next several hours with my camera pointed straight down at the floor. My feet were in the water, and I had a relatively long lens on. I think it was a 75 to 300 maybe. And I was just zooming in very tight to isolate tiny little elements of this stream. Now, this is very natural color. This hasn't been significantly enhanced or modified in Photoshop or anything like this. This really is just the straight photograph. And it was around this time that I realized my pull towards abstraction is really ultimately about separating the photograph from what it was a picture of. And maybe that'll become a little bit more clear as I talk more about the process. But my aim in photography is not at all to communicate something that happened or something that I found or a story. There's no real deep meaning here. It is very much about the aesthetic. It's the visual. It's what it looks like. Okay. And I think that's a real departure. And that's what sets true abstract photography apart, maybe from all the other genres. Here's a photo taken in a collector's house, just a quick snap showing that same picture printed on canvas and then hand embellished with acrylic. I use clear or transparent acrylic over the top just to accentuate the shapes and the textures of the work. Again, this is on canvas. And this is 90 by 90 centimeters. So this is very much along the lines of the kind of mixed media art that I produce from the abstract photography. Let's just take a quick turn here to talk, at least so we're on the same page, about what do I mean fine art. I mean, the title of this talk is Abstract Photography as Fine Art. Well, I think it might help so that we're all coming at this from the same place. So let's at least identify that in this context, at least, what I mean by fine art is creative expression. Now, there are a lot of different types of visual art. There's a lot of types of photography and means of sharing pictures with each other. But very specifically, when we talk about the fine arts, it's about an artist having an idea or a feeling or something to say, and then producing work that expresses that. This is very, very different than creating work specifically to communicate a message or even to tell a story. If you think about documentary photography, for example, that a successful documentary photograph is going to convey a lot of information, and it is very little about the ideas and the feelings or the expression of the creator of the picture itself. Well, what then is abstract photography? This is something that is debated a lot, and every time that I give talks about this or when I look online, if you do a Google search, and maybe you do this after the talk sometime, do a Google search for abstract photography, and you'll see what I mean, that what comes up, the vast majority of the results are not truly abstract. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about photography as a medium, it's very much a record, right? You're recording and capturing. We use the word capture to talk about a digital image, right? So you're recording something that you saw, something that happened, a moment in time. A photograph as a record is very much, there's a very a broad capacity to communicate information and ideas. That is why photography has taken off like it has, because most photographs are designed to share something that happened, something, a moment, an event. If you think about wedding photography, sports photography, any kind of events, right? That the success of the pictures are about conveying something and telling a story. Abstraction is really, really quite different than that. With an abstract photograph, the subject that you've taken the picture of is not the main point of the picture. But this is kind of ironic, because the question that always comes up when I show somebody one of my abstract pictures, before they find out that it's a photograph, they might like it, they might not like it, doesn't really matter, but they have a response to it that's based on the visual, based on the aesthetic. As soon as people know that it's a photograph, the next question always is, well, what is it, right? And my point to this is that what it is doesn't have really anything to do with the success of the picture, right? I'm trying to create images that make you feel something, or that remind you of something, or that inspire your imagination. So what it's actually a picture of doesn't really matter at all. That being said, there's no doubt that certain subject matter lends itself much better to abstraction than others. And for this reason, over the years, I've kind of moved away from as much nature photography, because actually I find that shooting in nature, it's very, very rare to find things that you can really make an abstract picture, because we'll identify right away what it is. Shooting in an urban environment, though, for whatever reason, is a lot more easy to find true abstractions. I'm going to show you a lot more pictures as examples here in a minute. Again, just so we're all on the same page, on one hand, you have figurative work, representational, photography that is meant to convey a story, an idea, a concept. A picture is 1,000 words, right? On the other hand, you have true abstraction, where it really is shape, line, texture, color, right? It's all the visual elements, but that it does not at all have to mean something specific. And this is one of the things that I love so much about abstraction, is that every viewer who sees a picture potentially can make something of it different from the next person. It's very, very subjective. It's very personal. And an abstract photograph invites the viewer to engage and be a part of the process, where a photograph that's much more literal or that conveys a lot more information, a picture of a beautiful sunset on a beach, right? Everybody can appreciate how beautiful, how nice, what it would feel like, right? It conveys all this information, but it doesn't leave a lot to the imagination. So this is where I think abstraction comes in, that it leaves an open-ended question for the viewer to decide themselves. And this is why it's so different than a lot of other types of photography. With all that being said, then, it's important to understand that good abstract photographs really depend on design and composition. Things like color, texture, shape, form, right? All of the building blocks. One of the reasons why abstract photography gets kind of slated or dissed a little bit, especially among fine art photography and it may be in the broader visual arts, it's not enough to take your camera and throw it out of focus and take a picture and call it abstract, or to wave it around wildly and take out, whatever images result and say, there's my abstract pictures, right? Because that's not doing anything with intention or design, or you're not actually creating something. You're using the device to just capture something that happens to be out of focus, right? So an out of focus picture may or may not be abstract, but it certainly doesn't make it a good photograph, right? Here's an example of what I would call a true abstract photograph, in that it is almost impossible for most people to identify what this is. Now, when I say almost impossible, this is one of the beautiful things about abstraction. Some people might recognize this right away and know what it is. And that again, because it's so subjective, that an abstract picture depends on the knowledge or the understanding, the perspective of the viewer. And what might be abstract for one person may not be so abstract for another, depending on your experience and your background and your knowledge. I will tell you what this is a picture of. And throughout this talk today, I will share with you the secrets of what a lot of these things are. Sometimes, even when I tell you, you won't be able to quite match it up because it's been so far removed from its context. This is window film on the inside of the back window of a car. I was leading a photo tour in Croatia. I think it was Croatia, somewhere in Europe, leading a group around, and we're walking from one place to another and walking through this car park. And I saw this van with all of this bubbly, peely film that had started to come away from the glass. And so this literally is nothing more than a close-up, tightly framed little section of this bubbly window film on the inside of a car, okay? But what makes this abstract is that it's completely depending on shape and tone. You can see that there's a full tonal range from bright highlights down to deep shadows and blacks, right? But it, again, is very, very two-dimensional. And that is a hallmark of a lot of my work. A lot of my favorite abstraction is very, very graphic, very simple, and two-dimensional. So to be successful making abstract photographs requires that you adopt a designer mentality. And by design, I mean you're going at it with intention. You have an idea that you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to construct something. You're trying to build something. Maybe ironically, abstraction is very much about reduction as well, right? Because we're maybe zooming in tighter. We're cropping out different elements that would give clues and context. But you're always starting with something that you're trying to accomplish. And that makes you very much, taking a designer mentality is that you've got an objective, right? And you're trying to create a series of events that are going to lead you to a successful conclusion. So your intention as a designer of photographs might be about conveying an emotion, right? Color can do this really well. Maybe, a bright red or warm oranges and warm colors, they convey a feeling, an emotion. Now, maybe there is some kind of a story or a meaning to it, But again, if it's abstract, you're going to have to let the viewer kind of jump to those conclusions themselves. The main thing about being a designer, though, is that you're visualizing your end result, right? And then breaking it down sort of backwards into steps and then working forward to the end. As I mentioned a few slides ago, composition and using the elements of design is so crucial to success in abstraction that the bulk of this presentation, what we're going to get into next, is going to be talking about composition, elements of design, and showing you examples of how they all come together to create a successful abstract picture. Now, very last, at the end of this whole discussion about making abstract photographs, is equipment. You know, we're not concerned about what kind of camera, what resolution, what number of megapixels, you know, what phone can you use, you know, what lenses. All of the gear literally is it's just a set of tools. Abstract photography, when it's done well, is more about what goes on in your mind and how you can see something that is going to produce a compelling result. And then you make your technical decisions. You decide about the gear just in service of reaching that objective. So, some basic principles of photographic design. I talk a lot about conscious intention. I mean, this is absolutely the most important thing and this actually applies not just for abstract photography, but any kind of photography. You have to know what you're trying to do. You have to be clear in your own mind about what kind of picture you're trying to make. Sometimes that means maybe having a little dialogue with yourself and using words, using language, talking to yourself through the process and being very clear and present about what it is you're trying to do. Always the most important question, what is this picture about? Okay. Now, if you get in the habit of asking yourself this every time you've got your camera or your phone and you're trying to frame up a picture, be asking yourself, what is this picture about? Now, reviewing a few slides ago, it could be an emotion. It could be a set of shapes. It could be, you know, tonal values. It could be textures. It could be intricate patterns and details, right? Whatever it is, you've just got to be super clear about it, because you got to get rid of everything else. I mean, everything. That is what, you know, the path to abstraction is reduction. And so you have to be clear about what gets to remain. What am I going to keep? And what should I eliminate? Right. And this is where the artistry comes in. This is how you become a designer of photographs and not just a photographer. This is how you can produce compelling abstractions and not just images that look accidental or random. Okay. This is the main thing. If you take one thing away from this talk today, it's that making good abstract pictures is not random or accidental. Okay. It's very deliberate. Let's review very quickly. Just get a drink here. Let's review how pictures work. Now, by pictures, I mean this could be paintings, drawings, photographs, of course, any kind of pictures. When we see things, it's all based on physiology and psychology. Now, what do I mean by that? First of all, physiology, the way that our visual perception actually functions. This is something that we all share. Everybody who can see, you know, and this is notwithstanding, you know, conditions with vision such as nearsighted or farsighted, color blindness, right? All of these things. I understand there's quite a range of the different capabilities and the way that people do see, but essentially, we all have two eyes. They're all horizontally opposed this way. This means that we're seeing the world as this horizontal oval, okay? And if you pay attention to what's just outside of your peripheral vision, you can see like where the edges of your vision are, right? And if you start to practice knowing where your main gaze is, then you can also be much more aware of what is in this horizontal oval of your peripheral vision. All people who have eyes and minds that work, you know, in the same way, are going to notice the brightest things first. We do this because we know, without even thinking about it, that where there is light, there's information. We can make out what's going on. If you look, in any corner of a room, if it's brightly lit, you can gain information from it. If the room is dark, or the corner or some area of the room is dark and murky, that you're not going to be able to make out as much what's going on. You got to keep this in mind in all of your photographs, abstract or otherwise, that the brightest things are going to attract attention because that's where the information is. Okay. The same thing goes for clear and sharp elements. So if you're trying to create the strongest composition, you have to be very conscious of the elements that are bright and clear and sharp, and recognize that that's where people's eyes are going to go. If that's not what you want people to be looking at, you have to change your composition accordingly. Okay. The last thing on this list is patterns. So after this all happens in a millisecond. And when you look at something, if there is a pattern there, the human mind will identify it, right? We always are very, very aware and can see patterns. And patterns can be very, very strong and dominate a composition. So again, if what you want is to show something over here, but there's a pattern here, you got to understand that people's eyes are going to be going to the pattern, because again, that's what our brains sort of latch onto. The most important technique in creating any visual art, especially abstract photography, is to direct the eye. You, as the creator of the picture, have to decide in advance where you want the viewer's eye to go, right? And you want them to follow a path. As we look at the rest of these pictures, pay attention to where your eye goes. And whatever kind of photography you do, especially if you're going to really continue doing abstraction, you have to be super, super sensitive to eye travel and the path that the viewer's eye will take through the frame. Here's an example of eye travel. Now, it is almost unavoidable that your eye will go to the circle in the center of the circle, right? Now, this may be one of those photographs that it's not really truly abstract, because you can kind of make out what it is, what are the elements, but it's very graphic, it's very minimal, it's trending towards abstraction, but it's a strong example of design and composition, right? And that the way that a viewer is going to experience this from both a physical and a psychological sense is likely to be very, very consistent across the board, right? Because the contrast created by the light against the dark and the little pattern that's created by the small circles that form the bigger circle, right? And there's a lot of sort of visual echo that happens throughout this picture, where there's multiple elements, one here and one here, that are similar, and they're sort of self-referencing to one another, right? So a picture like this is very, very formal in its construction. And it's, again, a good example of how I'm directing your eye, right? There's something that I saw that I thought was interesting, and I created the framing to ensure that you're going to look exactly where I want you to look, right? And if you look closer at this one too, you'll also make out that there's tiny little pencil marks on the wall, sort of surrounding. There's an X with a square around it, surrounding whatever they had drilled into this wall, right? So to me, this is the fun of abstraction, because it is absolutely about design. It's about seeing, and it's about sort of that psychological response that catches your imagination and sort of trips your mind into reminding you of things that you know, things that you don't know, questions you have, experiences that you've had, right? I mean, it can all kind of come in that instant. The psychological response, though, and here's where people diverge. And this is, again, is one of the great things about abstraction. When I look at a picture, I bring to that experience my background, my history, what I know, what I've learned, what I've experienced. And when you look at the same picture, you're viewing it through a different set of eyes, right? And so this psychological response is really triggered by associations, right? An association is something that it reminds you of something else, right? Basically, the human mind works by building on what it already knows, right? So you have your memories, you have your personal preferences, things that you gravitate to, right? And this is why one person will absolutely love a certain picture and another person will absolutely detest it, right? I'm here to tell you that the response to my work is so widely ranging, and it's amazing to see that one person will absolutely fall in love with one picture and the next person will say they can't stand it, right? And you got to have a bit of a thick skin, obviously, but understand that as visual artists, this is the world that we inhabit, you know, and a lot of it comes down to emotion. Some pictures will really trigger somebody's emotion, and that may be positive, it may be negative, but either way, you as the artist and the designer of photographs, you are creating this stimulus, right, for somebody to react to. And abstraction has a stronger way to do that than any other kind of photography. So into the elements of design. Sorry, just need another drink here. 1 second. My mouth gets tired and dry after talking so much. The elements of design. Now this sort of goes for all photography, all visual arts. I mean, painters, architects, illustrators, everybody who makes pictures needs to know this stuff. I'm using this as an example list to go through, you know, quite a significant selection of my abstract photographs that sort of illustrate each of the points. So the first point is point. This is the basic building block. A point is anywhere that your eye changes direction. You remember a few minutes ago, I mentioned how when you look at a photograph, you really need to pay attention to where your eye goes. A picture like this is made mostly of points. Your eye is going sort of playing hopscotch, going from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. Now, we all might sort of start and finish in a different place with a picture like this. And I'll be the first to admit, it's not the most attractive image ever made. But again, it's a good example of how points are creating lines for your eye to follow, okay? And so you need to be really aware of where your eye is going and where it starts, where it goes next, and then ultimately where it finishes up. This is another set of points. There's enough points in this picture that it's almost sort of making up a texture or a very rough, loose pattern. But it's important to understand that there is also one main point in this picture, and that is, sorry, I don't have a pointer function here. Sorry, I should have done that. But you see where it comes down to the point, down at the bottom left of the picture, that's what we would call a focal point. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, because having a strong focal point is probably even more important in abstraction than it is in other kinds of photography. But this is, again, is a picture largely made of more points. Now, coincidentally, this also is a picture of some type of film, a window film inside a phone booth in Warsaw. If points are the places where your eye changes direction, lines are what connects those points, okay? Now, here's where we start to get into emotional responses, because we all know instinctively and psychologically that lines sort of create feelings. We all share the response to a line that's sort of wavy, right? And meandering or curving, like an S curve, right? An S curve has a feeling, it has a mood, it has a sort of a meaning of its own, right? Whereas a jagged line, one with lots of angles and sharp turns, has a totally different feeling, right? So as you're making a picture, you need to be aware of the eye travel through the frame and how the lines that are created are creating a mood at the same time. Here's a very, very minimal photograph This is a close-up of a garage door in the city center of Paris. And as I was just meandering down the road, I spotted this door that was covered with a very a thin sort of a veneer of dirt, from years of rain pelting against it. And then this very thin line that is rust from the door opening and closing. Okay. To me, this is about as minimal as I generally go with my photographs. And because, this literally is just about a line. But what's important about this composition is how it subdivides the frame exactly down the center, and then it terminates down at the bottom sort of quarter, right? So the proportion and balance that's created in a composition like this is really important for its success. These are lines also, but very, very different kinds of lines, right? Very different character. There's obviously more than one line as well, but if you look at like the light blue colored line, how it has sort of this lightning bolt shape, how it looks like it's sort of meandering in a semi-straight way, and then suddenly turns and juts over to the side and then out of the frame. That is an experience that a viewer actually feels when they look at the picture. This is just a simple photograph of a reflection in a very mirrored surface, right? And that's why it's kind of warbly and rippled, okay? But it's a picture about lines. It's about graphics. It's very minimal in its color palette and in the shapes. A lot more lines here. This is made using a technique called intentional camera movement. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that and have probably practiced that yourself. This photograph was made of wet pebbles, stones on a beach in Italy. The blue is the shady areas, and the yellow wavy lines were made from the specular reflection of the rising sun. So it was a beach, as far as the eye could see, covered with these round, wet rocks, each with a little highlight on them. And so I moved the camera during a fairly, a longer exposure to sort of swipe to create this sort of side-to-side movement. So intentional camera movement is a technique that sometimes I use depending on the circumstances and if it will create the effect that I'm looking for. So when we talk about points connecting to form lines, well, then when we have lines connected, now we're looking at shapes. And shapes also have feelings to them. Again, very simple examples, and these are things that we all know since early childhood. We know that a circle feels different than a triangle, right? And those feel different than a square. Okay, so here's a photograph. These are two boat hulls. This is in a dry dock in the state of Maine in the US. Two boats, sort of one in front of another, shot with a long telephoto lens to really compress and flatten that perspective. Again, that is a signature hallmark of my work, that I'm flattening things out. But this picture is all about the shapes. Again, all about the shapes. And in this one, it's important to sort of note that there's a tiny little sliver of red showing through sort of in the middle upper right area. And that is really, really key to the composition, right? And when I shot this handheld, so as I'm moving around, this is a construction site. A lot of you might recognize that orange construction netting against a painted sign behind it. I was moving very slightly to try and create exactly the composition I wanted. And having that tiny little focal point was really key to this composition. Now, I keep mentioning that I like to make pictures that are very flat and two-dimensional, but there is still room in abstraction for adding the third dimension. And when you start adding light and shade, then that's what we call form. And form reveals depth and dimension in a picture. This picture, incidentally, was taken just after that previous one at the construction site. This is inside the restaurant where our group was going. I was leading a photo tour in Italy, and the group was taking a break for lunch. And this was the section of the ceiling inside the restaurant. And this shows a lot more sort of the three-dimensional form. What I love about a picture like this is that it reminds me of so many other things, right? It reminds me of a sand dune, or maybe a nude, right? Like a reclining nude studio portrait. It has a lot of sort of metaphor in its visual components. This is part of a series. Actually, I've got a couple of these pictures. These are showing three-dimensional form. These are made with intentional camera movement, just rotating around the center of the lens. So here's one. This is made using the exact same technique. You can see this one has, quite a three-dimensional feeling to it. You can almost reach in to the center of those circles. And again, this is made using the same technique, but I didn't get the rotation exactly right. So it kind of shifted a little bit. I love the feeling of this against that solid fuchsia background. It reminds me of kind of like, I don't know, a jellyfish or something in a petri dish or something. Again, it's all sort of subjective and open to interpretation. I mentioned about how strong patterns can be. The main thing about patterns is that they're uniform, they're geometric, and they're repeating. This is just a selection of belts for sale hanging in a market I believe in Zagreb, Croatia. Now, the success of this picture depends on having a main focal point. If you look up sort of towards the upper right, you can see that there's a sort of a terminus, one of the lines, and that does create an anchor, right? You're really looking for places where you can anchor the viewer's eye. Now, when you're dealing with patterns, this is a cutaway of a boiler of a locomotive in the York Train Museum. When you're dealing with patterns, usually the strongest way to use a pattern in a photograph is actually to break the pattern somehow. So this is actually the photograph as I shot it, but to illustrate that point, I just quickly went into Photoshop and colored one of these circles. And you can see now the effect, how having one of these elements that's different than all the others creates an extremely strong visual anchor. This creates a focal point to the entire picture. Very, very different with the slight change of color. Now, I should point out that this type of manipulation is not something that I normally do in my photography. All of these pictures that I'm showing you, essentially, they are as I saw them and as I shot them. And that's what I love about abstraction and this type of minimal approach to photography, that I'm trying to discover pictures as I'm going out in the world, or even if I'm working in the studio, I'm trying to create something special just by the use of the framing. Now, texture is a little bit different than pattern in that it's more random and it's more organic. But most importantly, with a texture, you can almost imagine what it would be like to run your hands over it, right? It's either rough or smooth, or very fine-grained or very coarse, right? And this picture shows a lot of texture from the underside of a boat in Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Now, this is also texture, but it's much softer. This is intentional camera movement. This is shot at Castle Bolsover off the M1 in Derbyshire. Now, the effects of color are also very pronounced. I mentioned this a little earlier. You think of red, orange, yellow, kind of warm colors, and how they're very different than cool, blue, purple, and green. Well, there is not only a psychological effect there, but in fact, warmer colors like red tend to come forward in a picture space, right? They feel like they're advancing, whereas cooler colors will recede. A photograph like this depends absolutely on color. This would not work as monochrome or black and white. This is shot with a very long lens. I think this was 400 millimeters, and I may have put an extender on this as well to get the reach, because this is a very, very high building This is in Amsterdam, reflections from metal from the ground underneath. This was made with intentional camera movement. And obviously this picture is all about color, right? This picture would not work in black and white, although I'll show you in a minute some techniques of how turning things black and white can create much more abstraction. First of all, finding subjects that you think are interesting and that can produce a good abstraction. I, over the years, have found that looking up, for me, produces more interesting results than looking down. So I have a whole series, an ongoing body of work that I've created of ceilings. And this is an example of that. This is in the underground vaults or the cellar of a hotel in Barcelona. This is the same ceiling, just sort of across the way. It was kind of a big room with the most amazing ceiling. And you can see that with a subject like this, you know, depending on how far you want to zoom in or cropping, you know, different angles, there's just an infinite number of compositions here. This works extremely well printed directly onto metal, which I have been doing quite a lot lately. This also is the same ceiling. So, you know, this idea of finding subject matter that you can really work with, these three pictures coming from the same location is really, really fantastic when you can find a set of raw materials and that has so much potential. Making a lot of these pictures, especially the more abstract ones, require kind of imagining what the picture is going to look like ahead of time. One little trick I recommend, if you want to see what a picture really might look like, you know, more than what you can see with your two open eyes, is just cover one eye or close one eye. That's going to give you a better idea of what the picture will come out like, because you're seeing it more like the single lens of a camera. This is the signature image of this talk, and this is part of my series called Shapeshifter. Again, this is a highly mirrored reflective surface showing these sort of wavy, ripply reflections. But again, this is just a straight photograph. This is how it looked to my eye. And what I had to do to set about to make this picture was choose the right lens, zoom in on the right spot, make sure the focus was tack sharp. I was shooting this, I shot this location both handheld and with a tripod. Sometimes it helps to work handheld for a while. And then when you find an angle or you find a composition, lock it down on the tripod. Again, the same location, just a totally different set of circumstances. And this is all based on just slight changes in perspective and moving around within the area. Same location again. This series is one that I've been producing a lot of finished artworks from lately, especially during the lockdown, where I go back through my archives and do more printing. And this one in particular, I print onto canvas and then hand embellish both with acrylic, and in this case, I've also added some iridescent foil transfer. I've been having just a great time with foil transfers, both metallic like gold and silver, as well as these transparent and translucent materials, just to add to the texture. But you know, again, I showed you the photograph. This is as I saw it, as I shot it. This is honest, straight photography. This is printed, so what you see on the canvas, it is all just as the photograph, but then I've taken other embellishments in certain spots just to kind of accentuate and highlight and work with the image. Here's another image from that same series. Most of these have sold at one point or another in my gallery. So taking different perspectives is obviously really important to find unusual angles and points of view. This, again, maybe not super abstract, but very graphic and interesting nonetheless, very close up. This is a shipping container behind a wire fence. This is a section of a ceiling in the Alhambra, or is it? No, it's the Alcazar in Seville. I mentioned earlier about how abstraction really is about reduction and elimination, right? What you're trying to do is remove visual clues. You're finding what's most important and getting rid of everything else. Here's a picture I took in Spain, out wandering around a farm. This is from Italy. This is a close-up of a slide on a children's playground. Again, some children's playground equipment. This one is extremely minimal, obviously. It lacks a focal point. And you might ask, well, why not just make this in Photoshop? Well, you could, but I like to find things like this and take pictures of them. Creating a focal point really is quite important for most strong pictures, not just abstract, but of any kind, that you want a place for your eye to land on. You need to create an anchor. This is a fairly recent piece. I've really kind of over the years, I used to work a lot in very bright, vibrant color, and I'm finding now that a lot of my more recent pictures are a little bit more monochrome and more somber, I guess. This actually is color. This is a color image. It's just this black wrinkly paper, but you can see that there is a very clearly defined focal point. There's a place for your eye to rest. Now, you can make abstractions through camera techniques as well. This is macro. I've been doing some test shots and experiments in my studio, seeing what I can do with different materials, working with glass and foil, and really getting tight with a true one-to-one macro lens. This is intentional camera movement, just a straight up and down swipe, like some of the intentional camera movement shots I showed you earlier. This is also ICM. This is a recent commission that we sold in Leamington Spa, printed and hung on the wall of the collector. This one has also been hand embellished with acrylic. So we should also recognize that you can make abstractions through your processing. Here's a sort of straightforward nature shot, which is not very abstract in and of itself. But when you make it monochrome, it makes it more abstract, right? Because you're removing the color, you're removing clues, you're removing context. Another example, this is a close-up of some colored tiles reflecting stained glass in Seville. Rotating it 90 degrees, making it monochrome, makes it more abstract. Another example, this is a close-up. This is in Lisbon, Portugal. There's some graphics stuck on a door, which is really pretty abstract to begin with, but even more so that way, right? And it really is just as simple as converting to monochrome and maybe rotating it, depending on the picture. This is a negative image. This is a close-up, almost macro shot of tree bark, just converted to negative. So it's all gone blue. So establishing priorities is really key. You need to ask, what is this picture about? What am I trying to say? How can I emphasize this? How can I reduce it? And how can I lead the viewer's eye? I really recommend that you practice and work towards developing bodies of work. You want to work in series. You want to, take notes, do sketches, make test photos with your smartphone. Take this designer's mentality towards creating series of work rather than just, a picture of this, a picture of that. Now, we've only got a couple of minutes left. We're coming up almost to the end of the presentation time here. I will talk for a minute, though, about exhibiting and selling, because I believe once you've created a body of work, it's really important to get it out there to the world. So considerations for your production that are going to be really crucial: size and format. By format, I mean, what is the finished thing? you want to be thinking like a product designer and thinking, what is the physical, tangible thing? How are you going to print it? You know, I enjoy printing my work on a wide range of materials. And in a lot of ways, that really finishes the work. You know, it brings sort of a conclusion to the abstract photography. Decisions about how it should be mounted and framed, you know, all of these things need to be approached with some measure of consistency, especially if you're putting up an exhibition. You want everything to be really sort of unified so that it represents as a body of work. Now, in terms of exhibiting your work, there are a lot of places that you can show outside the camera clubs or you know, the group exhibitions. I mean, you obviously have commercial galleries. A vanity gallery is where you effectively pay for wall space, you know, which certainly has its place. Art fairs, you know, we've had a lot of success showing and selling at art fairs and festivals. High street shops, you know, if you've got a good relationship with somebody who sells any kind of artwork or pictures, you know, to have a conversation and see if somebody would be willing to hang something up and sell it for you. You can also put on your own shows. I've done a number of exhibitions, mainly at hotels, where I'll just hire an event, you know, a function room and host my own shows. And of course, you can have open studio events where if you've got space that's appropriate for people to come and visit, you can bring people in and show them. So I should point out this picture here, this is the Oxford International Art Fair. I was showing photography and photography-based mixed media, but you can see that mainly it was not a photography exhibition. And there are some real advantages for photographers showing your work in places that it isn't just all photography, right? And so this show was very successful for us. So I feel like doing these group art fairs and festivals is a good way to get the work out there. This is an exhibition I did at the St. James Hotel in Nottingham a few years ago. They're unusual for a hotel where they have a purpose-made art gallery space. So they invited me to show, and this is kind of a retrospective collection of abstract works over the years. You may recognize a few of the pieces in there. This is a similar set of work showing at the Pedestrian Gallery in Leicester. We've also done a lot of these sort of smaller art fairs and even kind of craft festivals. This is inside a marquee. I think this is Foxton Locks, if I'm not mistaken. So, you know, once you've got a body of work and you've made some prints and you've mounted them in such a way that they can actually hang, then, you know, your next set of work is to get it out there into the public. And there are a lot of ways to show and exhibit photography. You will find people, especially as your work evolves and develops and becomes more refined, you will find that you can get people who support your vision and create partnerships with them. Now, dealers, that can include gallerists, but there are other kinds of art dealers, people whose job it is to sell art, consultants, designers, publishers, and retailers. These people all, they need new product. And, you know, my business is formed around the idea of using photography to produce something tangible and physical and real that somebody will hang up on the wall and love and enjoy and appreciate for a lifetime. This is a partnership I had with a restaurant in Leicester. This is soon after I moved here to the UK. And I just needed places to show the work. So I put up these canvases in the restaurant for a couple of months. And that was a real successful partnership. This is a piece that was commissioned, bespoke, for a hotel. This is the Best Western Nottingham Derby, I think it's called, off the M1. And this is some intentional camera movement. This photograph was printed to traditional, it's a C print, you know, traditional photo paper, and then laminated onto MDF board. It's called plaque mounting. creates a very durable, rigid finish where it's in a high traffic area like this. So that is it for the presentation. We have now 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. Before I turn it back over to Avril, I just want to mention you can find out a lot more about my work and my business and my services at my own website, of course. But I also wanted to announce for the first time today that in April of this year, we are hosting an online virtual conference. And it's all about photography as fine art specifically. So it's about creative expression. We're still working on the speaker lineup and the scheduling. The website is still in development, but we do have the website there where if you're interested, you can go and register your interest and get on the mailing list so we can let you know when everything goes live. And of course, you can always reach me on all of the major social media platforms. So thank you, everybody. With that, I'm happy to turn it back over to Avril and we'll do some Q&A.
Thank you, Nat. You can switch off your screen. You can switch off your screen sharing now.
Okay, I will do that.
It's time now, everybody, if you haven't already done so, to post your questions via the Q&A icon. But please remember, questions only. Nat, that was an absolutely brilliant talk. Thank you so much. It's really defined for me what abstract is. And I've just written down a couple of things while you were talking, which really resonated with me, that actually it's the path to abstraction is reduction. And it's not random. That really sort of stuck with me from the talk. So thanks for that. I think it was brilliant. I've learned a lot. Thank you. For more information about Nat, we'll have his address up, his website address up at the end, and also we'll be sending out to you a link with our survey and a link to his recording in a day or so. But let's start with the questions for now. First of all, I've got a question, from Lois Wakeman. Thank you, Lois. She says, I've had a couple of local abstract exhibitions that were successful and sold quite well, but do you have any tips for convincing curators that photography isn't a poor second cousin to proper art? Oh, this resounds with me, i.e. paintings, prints, etc., and worthy of equal consideration. I find this attitude quite hard to shift. I agree, Lois, but Nat.
I think any of us who have really had a go at this would agree wholeheartedly with that. Let me sort of reframe that problem a little bit. And I'm hoping, I don't know how many more questions there are, but I hope we have a couple of minutes to focus just on this one because it's pretty significant. My thinking is, and my experience has been that number one, you should not seek to convince or change anybody's mind. Instead, you want to find people who already share your same worldview. Okay? Because I believe that convincing people is difficult, if not impossible. Okay? Sometimes you can, if you've got something that is so extraordinary, like that they have never seen before and never even imagined it could be like that, maybe they'll see the light, but usually not, because people's opinions and people's preferences are very sort of locked in stone. Now, this isn't just a problem, or it's not just an issue with abstract versus representational. And it's not just an issue with photography versus painting or versus sculpture or glass or whatever, right? I mean, it's a universal issue that people like what they like. And for them to start liking something else or to appreciate something else, a lot of times they need to have like a really good reason to do it. And it's got to sort of serve their own needs. Now, with the commercial side of things, if you're talking to gallerists, dealers, art consultants, people who just say, no, we don't sell photography. The main reason for that is that selling photography is probably among the hardest kinds of art to sell. And the main reason for that is that the public don't understand the value of it, and they don't know what they're paying for. They don't know how much something should cost, and they don't have a lot of sort of comparison of like for like. So it's confusing and unknown. And the one sure thing you can always count on, if somebody is confused or they're just not sure, they are not going to buy, or they're not going to carry your work. They're not going to commit, right? So start out by seeking people who are already believers, right? Don't try and change anybody's mind. Along the way, you might change some people's minds, but not because you tried.
I agree.
Does that address that comprehensively enough?
I think it really does. Thank you,
Okay.
Nat. I've got a question from Claudia Frost. I think that this is actually going to be done anyway. It says, could you post the name and location of Nat's gallery? But I think you've given us that to put on the email that we're sending round, haven't you?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's fine. You will get that, Claudia. Okay. Then I've got a question here from John Humphrey. What does it mean to use acrylic to enhance the texture of a canvas print, as on the framed image shown on the yellow wall?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm happy to talk about that. That is a technique that I've developed over many, many years, and I'm happy to share it, and not so concerned about, losing a competitive edge by giving away all my best ideas, actually, and let me rephrase that. I want you all to try it, because it is just so much fun and the results can be so amazing. So the way it works is quite simple and literal, that I print my photograph on canvas. I do all my own printing. I print for a lot of other artists and photographers as well. I print my canvas, I stretch it, and then over the surface of it, I use clear acrylic with brushes or spatulas, palette knives, sponges, whatever implements, to apply the clear acrylic onto the surface of the canvas. And when I'm putting the acrylic on, it's not clear to start. It's white when you're working with it, but it dries clear. And I use whatever implement will follow the structure of the image, right? So if it's kind of mottled and textury speckled, then I'll use a sponge. If it's like sweeping kind of granular gradiated lines, then I'll use a thick, heavy brush, right? So whatever the texture in the image is, I try and follow over it and enhance it with the application of the acrylic. And what I've started doing more recently is using foil transfer. And this comes on a carrier sheet, and it comes in all different colors, metallic and otherwise. And you can rub it down, or you can use adhesive and glue it down, and then, peel off the transfer sheet. Effectively, what I'm doing is, while trying to stay as authentic and true to the original photograph as I can, I'm trying to make it more, or bring out the expression of it, bring out the character of it by enhancing the texture and the contours. So I'll go along edges and build them up so it's very thick, right? And so the surface of the print, or the painting, you would call it when it's done, is very, very heavily textured and has a lot of ridges and ripples and bumps and things. And the really interesting effect of that is that it has the appearance of kind of refracting or lifting the color from the canvas. And when it's done, it doesn't actually look like clear acrylic. It looks like it's colored paint in some cases. Really interesting effect. But I only use the brand called Liquitex. I strongly support and endorse and love all their products. I use Liquitex gel medium, and it comes in tubs, and you just put it on the surface and let it dry. Yeah. And as I said, I've developed this over many years, and I don't see it done anywhere else. So, which is the only reason for my comment about giving away my trade secrets. But the best answer to that is that if you're in the UK or can get here, then come to my gallery, and I'll show you how I do it, and I'll show you the finished results.
Oh, that'd be great. It sounds like you put a lot of your emotion into that as well, which is, again, something else you talked about in your presentation.
So fun and exciting.
Feel it coming through when you're talking about it.
Art should be that way. And I find that, unfortunately, photography doesn't always carry that, and for whatever reason. I know a lot of photographers are very serious about their craft and are very dedicated to technical perfection and to, winning competitions and things and getting distinctions and awards and gaining merit in the execution of this, the function of the camera and the computer and the printer. And it's more than that. It's got to come from your heart. You got to love what you do. Otherwise, when other people see the work, it'll fall flat. If you don't love it to begin with, then how can you expect someone else to love it?
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. I've got a question here from Peter Bozeman. He says, how much of abstract photography is in the taking of the photo as opposed to the post-production?
That is a bit of a loaded question, depending on what you love to do. Now, I would never put down or diminish the practice of people who like to do composite work, right? Back when I was a graphic designer by trade, I used to love making Photoshop composites, right? Using layers and masks and building things up and doing, digital photo montage effectively. And I still enjoy it. But with my personal work, with my abstraction, to me, the fun is in the camera work and finding the shot, or even if I'm constructing a shot, right? Sometimes I'm working with tabletop setups and, building a picture before actually taking it. But I enjoy photography for the making of the picture with the camera. And so, as I mentioned in the presentation, all those pictures that I showed, they have not been done up in Photoshop. They have not been, composite multiple elements. They're not, photo montage. They're not heavily adjusted in color or contrast or anything. That is how I shot them. And I decided sort of early on in my journey that if I'm going to be a photographer and if I'm going to do abstract photography, then I'm putting the majority of the emphasis on the shooting, right? On the seeing it, the pre-visualizing, what's the picture going to be, the finding it, and then the actual, the capturing of the image. If I can't get a picture that I'm happy with in the camera, then I don't bother with it in the computer. I want my art to be representative and reflective of work with the camera. But again, I'm not trying to put down the work of people who prefer to do it in the computer. I mean, it's perfectly valid and legitimate to make. I mean, if it's amazing, then who really cares how it was made, right? I mean, and I have a lot of good friends who love doing photo montage and composite work and love doing layers and effects in Photoshop. And there's nothing wrong with that. But, for my work, it's very much straight photography.
Yeah. I think it's something great as well that we can all do. Now we're in lockdown, I'm going to search my house for things, for abstract.
Well, that's the thing. Abstraction, once you get in the habit and the practice and build some skills, abstract photographs can be made and can be found absolutely anywhere. right? I mean, there's no reason not to be productive and creative and making images that you really love, without being so dependent on conditions.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. I've got another interesting question here, actually, from Liz Kenny. She says, if we have regard to the horizontal oval field of view, what implications does this have for the choice between a landscape and portrait aspect ratio?
That is a fundamental question, and it's a choice that you have to make kind of early on. And in order to answer that, I'm actually going to try and do this physically in a visual way. If you're envisioning a photograph or any artwork, right, and you know what this kind of feels like, and you know what this kind of feels like, then that is your choice. And you notice that a lot of my abstracts are vertical, right? A lot of them are in the portrait orientation because it's the energy, right? Think of it in terms of visual energy, that I like this sort of like upward motion. Or in the case of like the thin line, it's like that dropping down and then stopping, right? So think of it dynamically, think of it physically, like, is it up and down or is it side to side? And, let your gut feeling, determine that. Once you've sort of identified which way is best, you need to match up the composition and create, position the graphic elements in such a way that supports that. Because otherwise, if you're using a portrait orientation, you end up with something that feels chopped off, right? And that's why landscape photographs, right? If you're shooting the grand scenic, it's usually horizontal because you want that, that feeling of space and the grand, the vista, right? And if you do a landscape photograph vertically, then it feels truncated, it feels chopped, right? And abstract is the same way, right? So kind of go by the feeling of it.
Right, okay. We've got quite a few questions here. I hope you're okay to do a few more, are you,
We can
Nat?
do a couple more. I think
Yeah.
we should probably finish at 1:30.
Okay.
But just
brilliant.
let me just remind everybody that this is what I do for a living, and working one-to-one with people or in small groups. I mean, I love it. So get in touch with me. If you want me to review a portfolio, if you're interested in showing in the gallery, if you want some one-to-one training, if you want printing, like, this is what I do. So don't worry that when we stop today, that's the end of it, right? I hope you would reach out and get in touch with me, and, feel free to send me questions.
Okay, I've got a question from Ken Clark. He says, hi, Nat, who were the fine art and abstract photographers that influenced you at the start of your photographic journey?
That is a great question. And if that's Ken Clark, my friend here in England, hello, Ken. And I'm glad you could join us. It's interesting that you'd ask that, because that actually is what I've provided as my list of links for resources to send in the follow-up. But I will mention a couple. Aaron Siskind is always at the top of my list. And if you look at the work of Aaron Siskind, you'll see that he did mainly street photography. So the majority of his work is sort of documentary and representational and kind of what you think of street photography. But then when you look at what he's done in abstraction, then I think you'll make the immediate connection of how there's not a long leap. When you're working with a two-dimensional medium like photography, there's not a huge leap going from shooting street scenes to getting in tighter and closer and more intimate shots that very quickly can become abstract. Brett Weston is a guy who did that in nature. So those are two examples and they both shot mainly black and white as well. And this is, sort of going back to the 40s and 50s and 60s. This is historical stuff. But these are people who had a journey similar to mine, that at first we start off shooting the great big wide world. And gradually you get in closer and closer and closer to the things that really grab you and the things that really speak to you and mean something. So yeah, a list of influences and inspiration will be coming to everybody.
Great, that's great, thank you. Colin Harrison asks, how and what metal do you print on?
Mainly aluminium. And the way that I prefer to print on aluminium is using a direct print. So it's on a flatbed printer. Usually they are they're solvent-based inks that are cured with UV light. So the sheet of metal is fed through the printer flat, with the head goes over the top of it, and then as it comes out, it's dried and cured as it leaves the printer. Flatbed printing can be used to print on really any type of rigid substrate. So you can print on perspex, plexiglass and acrylic. You can print on wood, on glass, and of course all kinds of metal. So when I'm printing on aluminium, it's usually a product called Dibond, and Dibond is thin sheets of aluminum for North Americans, or aluminium here in the UK, with a very thin resin-based sort of perspex layer in the middle. And it comes in either white or just a brushed metal finish, or like a mirror finish. It has all these different sort of looks to it. So depending on what the image is, I will choose the type of substrate that will be the best expression of it. Sometimes it's canvas, sometimes it's photo paper. Not very often with my work. I usually, I'm trying to use kind of exotic materials. But when I'm printing on like an aluminium, like a sheet of Dibond with a brushed metal finish, looks absolutely amazing with imagery that kind of looks sort of reflective or metallic to begin with, whereas canvas works really good with stuff that's more kind of textural and organic. So I always like to match up the image with the ideal media.
Here's an interesting question from Josefa Torres. How do you price your art? That's an interesting one.
It's kind of a complicated one, as you might imagine. The simplest way is to do a lot of research and look around and go to the art fairs, festivals, and galleries and find examples of people who are doing work that you think is similar, and then figure out an average pricing based on what everybody else is doing. Because in all honesty, you can only price your work to what the market will bear anyway, right? There's no point, pricing it way high if people aren't going to see the value or understand where the price came from. You need to price your work with respect to where you are in your career, how advanced your body of work has become. Do you have demand for the work? Are there, is it in collections already? With all that being said, it's actually more common that people price their work too low. And over the years, I've tried every possible model for trying to figure out, what should something cost? And you can figure out your cost of materials. You can figure out, what is your hourly rate. You can go into infinite detail and then try and produce some figure that's representative. And it may still be miles away from what is the correct price of the piece, right? It'd be too high or too low. The simple answer is just price it like everybody else to start. And then if you get any success selling the work, you'll start to feel your way as to when it's okay to, start raising the prices. All in all, though, if here's another simple formula. If you are outsourcing your production, like say you come to me or a photo lab or somebody to do your printing and framing, a simple method is just to take your cost out of pocket for producing it and multiply it times 3 or maybe times 4, right? if you can get a 3 to 4x markup on your out-of-pocket production cost, then you're doing well in terms of sort of retail pricing model. You know, a more typical retail wholesale price is 50 or 100%, right? Wholesale price is 50% of the retail price. For art, that's a bit oversimplified, right? So if you're paying to produce the stuff, then just take what it cost you and multiply it times 4.
Yeah, very difficult question. Sorry about that one.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole webinar just about pricing strategy.
Okay, here's a question from Alan Sarsby. He says, I noticed that you don't use lead-in lines, but you do use rule of thirds. What is the scope of classical compositional approaches in abstracts?
I think, number one, rules are meant to be broken. We all, as visual artists, we all need to understand the principles behind what people consider rules, right? And the position, the placement of your main focal point is generally, I mean, that's when you're talking about rule of thirds or the golden mean or the golden ratio and all these other formulas for where should the main focal point be. You know, the more you do it, a lot of it comes down to gut feeling of where's the right place to put it, right? You're right, and you're very astute actually in pointing out about my rule of thirds, because that actually is something that I identified in my work very early on, that I did it sometimes without even knowing or without meaning to, that I just felt like, oh, it looks good here, or, you know, those corners. But there are other formulas for where to put your main focal point. With regard to leading lines, that is normally a technique used where you're showing depth, right? And so from the camera viewpoint, if you want to show distance, then you would use leading lines to draw the viewer in deep to the photo. And then, so for landscapes, you know, street scenes, any kind of scenic work, leading lines are really effective for bringing you in to the picture space. My work is very two-dimensional, right? So I do use lines and points to draw your eye, but we're mainly moving around this two-dimensional plane and not in.
Right. Okay. We've really come to the end of the time now, Nat. Did you want to answer one more, or shall we just leave it there?
Let's answer one more, just for good measure, and then let's just reiterate.
There are so many.
Let's
I don't know what to do.
Conversation going long after this, because
okay,
this is all good stuff.
Okay. This is probably a quick one, I hope. From Alan Cross, do you title your images, and how far does that steer the viewer's interpretation?
That's a great question. Yes, I believe every image should have a title that at the very least sounds like it was deliberate. I do actually have one piece in my body of work that I deliberately titled as Untitled. And that was very intentional. But for the most part, I like to give it a name, at least. Maybe if you think of it in terms of a name, that opens it up and makes it a little bit more free and a little bit more fun, rather than a title. A title can very strongly lead somebody. And sometimes that's good. Sometimes it should be used to sort of share something with the viewer. But if the point of abstraction is to invite them in and to have it, you know, have them make it their own, then you have to be careful with the titling so as not to sort of steer them too much one way. So my wife actually she's very good at poetry, and Ruth is good at sort of looking at an image and coming up with almost like haiku, you know, like 2 words, 3 words, something that kind of has a nice a melody almost to it, right? But that is not super literal, right? Now, more recently, I've noticed myself getting a little bit lazy with my titling, and I'm just as likely to title it for where I took the picture. But that I do think that titles are important. But again, like with every aspect of the craft, it's something that you make one decision today, and you try it, you see how it fits, you work with it, you share it with other people. You get sort of engagement and actively involved. I mean, having the work exhibited is the main thing.
Yeah.
Whatever it says as the name of the piece underneath is like a far, far lower, a lower point or a lower priority. But as time goes on, you sort of feel your way with these things. Then the best thing you can do is identify what your goals are and what you're trying to accomplish and what you have to say, and then make your decisions in the most authentic, true to yourself way that you can, and then give yourself freedom to change your mind later. I mean, really, we're in this for the long haul, right? A commitment to a life in the arts is not something, that a lot of people do dabble in it, but I don't think we're talking about that here, right? We're talking about owning it. Mm-hmm. And when you're in it for the long haul and you own your work, you own your photographic practice, then you got to understand that decisions you make today, you might change a year from now or even a week from now. When you get new information, change it, and don't try and hinge your whole creative practice around some, artificial set of conditions. Just do what's right for you, do what's best, keep doing it and do more and more of it, and make sure to get it out there and share it with other people.
That's great. Thanks so much, Nat. We have, just to show you how people have loved your talk, we have 29 questions still in, and I'm really sorry to everybody that we can't go on anymore.
I would hope people can understand that my answers.
No. I'm just saying that so you know how much people actually want to know more
that very much.
About,
and
want to know more. So, but that's really great. Thank you so much. And you've given us, so much, filled me definitely with things that I can do now during lockdown. I am definitely going searching for abstracts in my house. So thank you so much, Nat. For more information about Nat, please visit the web addresses, which will be shown on your screen in a moment. We will include this along with the link to the presentation and our survey in a day or so. The RPS Creative Eye and Digital Imaging Groups are very glad you joined us for this event. It's been the Digital Imaging Group's 13th online event, and we have many more in the pipeline. If you're not already a member of the Digital Imaging Group, you will find that although the fee for non-members is low, if you join our group, you will find that you will probably save money, and you can join as a digital-only member, which is a low price. Our next online event will be a talk by Jane Lazenby called Inspired by Art, and that's on Saturday, January the 30th. Same time, same place. So in the meantime, I'd like to wish you all a very good evening and stay safe. Goodbye.